Frank Morrison stood outside the unemployment office on a cold Tuesday morning in October 1987. He was a big man with rough hands and a face that showed every one of his 58 years. His work boots were caked with mud, and his jacket had paint stains from the last job. Frank had been building things for 30 years. He knew construction like other people knew their own names, but today, Frank had a problem. A big problem. The Millerville Bridge project was behind schedule. The old bridge that connected the two sides of town was falling apart. The city needed it fixed before winter came. If Frank did not finish the work in time, the town would be cut off when the snow started. People would not be able to get to work or take their kids to school. Frank's regular crew had left him 2 weeks ago. They found better jobs in Lincoln, the big city 2 hours away. The pay was better there and the work was easier. Frank could not blame them, but it left him in a tough spot. He needed workers and he needed them fast. Frank pushed open the glass door of the unemployment office. The building smelled like old coffee and cigarettes. A dozen men sat in plastic chairs reading newspapers or staring at the floor. Most of them looked like they had been out of work for a long time. Frank walked to the front desk. Behind it sat a woman with gray hair and thick glasses. Her name tag said Betty. "Morning, Betty," Frank said. "I posted a job notice last week. Any good men show up?" Betty looked through a stack of papers on her desk. A few people asked about it, Frank, but when they heard it was construction work on a bridge, most of them walked away. Said it was too dangerous. Frank shook his head. "It's not that dangerous if you know what you're doing." "What about the others?" "Well, there's Jim Patterson. He used to work construction." "Jim's got a drinking problem," Frank said. "I can't have him around heavy machinery." "There's also Robert Young. Bob's back is shot. He can barely lift a toolbox," Betty frowned. "That leaves just one person, Frank, but I don't think you'll be interested." "Why not?" "He's young. Real young. No experience at all." Frank rubbed his chin. "How young?" 19. "Just finished high school last spring. Never held a real job." "What's his name?" "Danny Sullivan. Nice boy, but green as grass." Frank looked around the waiting room again. The men sitting there were either too old, too sick, or too unreliable. "He was running out of options. Where is he?" Frank asked. Betty pointed to a corner of the room. "Over there. The skinny kid with the brown hair." Frank turned and saw him. Danny Sullivan looked like he weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. He wore jeans that were too big for him, and work boots that had clearly belonged to someone else. Probably his father. The boy was reading a book about construction methods, which surprised Frank a little. Frank walked over and sat down in the chair next to Danny. The boy looked up with bright blue eyes. "You Danny Sullivan?" Frank asked. "Yes, sir." Danny closed the book and sat up straight. "I'm Frank Morrison. I heard you're looking for construction work." "Yes, sir, I am." Danny's voice was steady, but Frank could see he was nervous. "Ever worked construction before?" "No, sir." "But I'm willing to learn. I'm a hard worker." Frank almost laughed. Every young man said he was a hard worker. Most of them had no idea what hard work really meant. "This isn't easy work, son. We're fixing a bridge. It's cold, it's dirty, and it's dangerous. You'll be working 10 hours a day, sometimes in the rain. Your hands will bleed, your back will hurt, and you'll go home so tired you can barely eat dinner." Danny did not blink. "That's okay, sir. I need the work. Why construction? Why not get a job at the diner or the gas station?" Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My dad was a construction worker. He died in a car accident when I was 12. But before that, he used to tell me stories about the things he built. Bridges, buildings, houses where families would live. He said construction workers were the people who built the world." Frank studied the boy's face. Danny was serious. There was something in his eyes that reminded Frank of himself when he was young and hungry for work. "You got a car?" Frank asked. "Yes, sir." "It's old, but it runs." "You live with your mom?" "Yes, sir." "And my little sister. She's 16. Your mom okay with you doing dangerous work?" "She needs me to work, sir. Dad's been gone 7 years now. Mom works at the diner, but it's not enough money. My sister wants to go to college. Someone has to help pay for it." Frank was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his own son, Michael, who lived in California now. Michael had a good job in an office and never got his hands dirty. Sometimes Frank wondered if he had raised his boy too soft. "I've never hired a greenhorn before," Frank said finally. "A greenhorn?" Danny asked. "Someone with no experience. Someone who doesn't know the difference between a hammer and a wrench." Danny smiled a little. I know the difference between a hammer and a wrench, sir. Despite himself, Frank almost smiled back. Smart mouth, huh? No, sir. Just trying to be honest. Frank stood up. He looked down at Danny, who looked back at him with hope in his eyes. Frank thought about the bridge. He thought about winter coming. He thought about having no other choices. Be at the bridge site tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock sharp, Frank said. Wear old clothes and bring work gloves. We'll try you out for a week. Danny jumped to his feet. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. Frank held up his hand. Don't thank me yet, son. Thank me if you're still working for me in a week. Most greenhorns quit after the first day. I won't quit, sir. We'll see, Frank said. He started to walk away, then turned back. One more thing. Don't call me sir. Call me Frank. Everyone else does. Yes, Frank. Frank nodded and walked out of the unemployment office. As he got in his truck, he wondered if he was making a mistake. He had 30 years of experience, and he had never hired someone with no experience before. But something about Danny Sullivan seemed different. Maybe it was the way the boy talked about his father. Maybe it was the book he was reading. Or maybe Frank was just desperate. He started his truck and drove toward the bridge site. Tomorrow would tell him if he had made the right choice or the biggest mistake of his career. Behind him, Danny Sullivan stood outside the unemployment office, holding his construction book and smiling. For the first time in months, he had hope. He did not know that this moment would change both his life and Frank's life forever. Winter was coming, and they had a bridge to build. Danny Sullivan woke up at 4:30 in the morning on his first day of work. He had barely slept. His stomach was full of butterflies, and his hands were shaking as he put on his work clothes. His mother had packed him a lunch and left a note saying, "Good luck, honey. Your father would be proud." Danny drove his old Ford to the bridge site in the dark. When he got there at 5:45, Frank was already waiting with 3 other men. They all looked like they had been working construction for years. Their clothes were stained with paint and grease. Their faces were hard and weathered. "This is Danny," Frank told the other workers. "He's new." The men looked Danny up and down. One of them, a big man with a gray beard, laughed. "He looks like he's 12 years old," the man said. "You sure he's old enough to work, Frank?" "His name is Pete Kowalski," Frank told Danny. "He's been doing this work longer than you've been alive." Another worker, a thin man with tattoos on his arms, shook his head. "I don't know about this, Frank. The kid looks like a strong wind would blow him over." "That's Rico Martinez," Frank said. "He thinks everyone under 30 is useless." The third man was younger than the others, maybe in his 30s. He had dark hair and a mustache. "I'm Tom Bradley," he said to Danny. "Don't worry about these old guys. They give everyone a hard time." Frank handed Danny a hard hat and safety glasses. "Put these on and keep them on. If I catch you without them, you're fired." Danny put on the equipment. The hard hat was too big and kept sliding down over his eyes. "Okay, everyone," Frank said. "We're starting on the south side today. Danny, you're with me. I want to see what you can do." The bridge was old and made of steel and concrete. Parts of it were rusted and cracked. Danny could see why it needed to be fixed. Cars had to drive slowly across it, and trucks could not use it at all. Frank showed Danny around the worksite. There were piles of steel beams, bags of concrete, and tools everywhere. A big crane sat next to the bridge, ready to lift heavy materials. "First thing you need to learn," Frank said, "is safety. One mistake can kill you or someone else. Always check your equipment. Always watch where you're walking. And always listen when someone yells a warning." Danny nodded. He tried to remember everything Frank was telling him. "Now," Frank said, "we're going to start by removing some of the old steel supports. I want you to help Pete with the cutting torch." Pete was already setting up his equipment. He had a tank of gas and a long hose with a torch on the end. When he lit it, a bright blue flame shot out. "Stay back, college boy," Pete said. "This isn't a job for beginners." "College boy?" Danny asked. "That's what we're calling you," Rico said, "because you look like you should be in college instead of doing real work." Danny's face turned red, but he did not say anything. He watched as Pete used the torch to cut through a piece of old steel. Sparks flew everywhere, and the metal glowed red hot where the flame touched it. "Now you try," Pete said, handing Danny the torch. Danny took the torch with shaking hands. It was heavier than he expected. When he tried to make a cut, the flame went everywhere except where he wanted it to go. "Not like that," Pete yelled. "You're going to set the whole bridge on fire." Danny tried again. This time he cut through his own safety rope by mistake. "What are you doing?" Frank shouted. That rope is what keeps you from falling off the bridge. Danny's face was bright red now. The other workers were shaking their heads and laughing. Sorry, Danny said. I'll be more careful. But things did not get better. After lunch, Frank asked Danny to help carry steel beams from the truck to the work site. The beams were heavy and awkward. Danny dropped the first one on Rico's foot. Ow, Rico yelled, hopping around on one leg. Watch what you're doing, kid. I'm sorry, Danny said. I didn't mean to. Just stay away from me, Rico said, limping away. In the afternoon, Frank asked Danny to read the blueprints and tell him what size bolts they needed for the next section. Danny studied the papers for 10 minutes, then gave Frank the wrong answer. When Frank realized the mistake, they had already drilled holes in the wrong places. That's 2 hours of work we have to do over, Frank said. He was starting to sound angry. By the end of the first day, Danny had made so many mistakes that the other workers would not even look at him. When Frank told everyone to pack up and go home, Danny felt like crying. Danny, Frank said, stay here a minute. Danny was sure he was about to be fired. He watched the other workers leave, shaking their heads and talking about him. That was the worst first day I've ever seen, Frank said. I know, Danny said quietly. I'm sorry. I'll do better tomorrow, will you? Because right now I'm thinking I made a mistake hiring you. Danny looked Frank in the eye. Give me another chance, please. I know I messed up, but I can learn. I want to learn. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, one more day. But if tomorrow is as bad as today, you're done. Danny drove home feeling terrible. His mother was waiting for him with dinner ready. How was your first day? She asked. It was okay, Danny lied. He did not want to worry her. But that night, Danny could not sleep. He kept thinking about all the mistakes he had made. He thought about Pete calling him college boy, and Rico limping away after he dropped the beam. Most of all, he thought about the disappointed look on Frank's face. The second day was even worse. Danny was trying so hard not to make mistakes that he made even more mistakes. He mixed up the measurements for a concrete pour, and they had to throw away $50 worth of concrete. He dropped a box of expensive bolts into the river. When he tried to help Tom move a ladder, he let go at the wrong time and the ladder fell over, knocking down a whole section of scaffolding. That's it, Pete yelled. I'm not working with this kid anymore. He's going to get someone killed. Frank pulled Danny aside. What's wrong with you? Yesterday you were just making beginner mistakes. Today you're making dangerous mistakes. I'm trying to be careful, Danny said. I'm trying to do everything right. Well, you're not. You're thinking too much and not paying attention to what you're doing. That afternoon, the worst thing happened. Danny was helping Rico move some tools when he tripped over a power cord. The cord was connected to an electric saw that Tom was using. When Danny pulled the cord out of the socket, the saw stopped working right in the middle of a cut. The piece of wood Tom was cutting flew back and hit him in the chest, knocking him off the scaffolding. Tom fell 8 feet and landed hard on a pile of steel beams. His left arm was bent at a strange angle and he was not moving. Call an ambulance, Frank yelled. Everyone rushed to help Tom. He was conscious but in a lot of pain. His arm was clearly broken, and he had cuts on his face from hitting the steel. I'm sorry, Danny kept saying. I'm so sorry. Tom looked at him with pain in his eyes. Just stay away from me, kid. The ambulance came and took Tom to the hospital. Frank told everyone else to go home early. Danny and Frank were the only ones left at the work site. Danny sat on a pile of lumber with his head in his hands. I should fire you right now, Frank said. I know, Danny said without looking up. Tom's got a wife and 2 little kids. He'll be out of work for at least 6 weeks with that broken arm. I know. Frank sat down next to Danny. What happened out there? You were being so careful and then you tripped over a cord that was right in front of you. Danny finally looked up. His eyes were red. I don't know. I was thinking about all the things I was supposed to remember and I guess I wasn't watching where I was walking. That's the problem right there, Frank said. You're thinking too much. Construction work isn't about thinking. It's about doing. It's about using your hands and your eyes and paying attention to what's happening around you. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Are you going to fire me? Frank looked at the bridge, then back at Danny. I'm driving you to the hospital to see Tom. You're going to apologize to him and his family, and then we're going to find out if you're really as sorry as you say you are. As they drove to the hospital, Danny stared out the window and wondered if his construction career was over before it really started. He thought about his father and wondered if he was disappointed in him too. Most of all, he thought about Tom Bradley lying in a hospital bed, because of something Danny had done. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and floor wax. Tom was in a room on the second floor with his arm in a cast. His wife Sarah was sitting next to his bed holding his good hand. She looked up when Frank and Danny walked in. "How are you feeling, Tom?" Frank asked. "Like I got hit by a truck," Tom said. "Doctor says I'll be in this cast for 8 weeks." Frank looked at Danny. "Danny has something he wants to say to you." Danny stepped forward. His voice was shaky when he spoke. "Tom, I'm really sorry about what happened. It was my fault, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix your arm or help your family, but I want you to know that I feel terrible about it." Tom looked at Danny for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what, kid? Accidents happen, but you need to be more careful." "This isn't a game," Sarah Bradley spoke up. "We have bills to pay and kids to feed. Tom being hurt means no money coming in." Danny felt even worse. He had not just hurt Tom, he had hurt Tom's whole family. As they drove back from the hospital, Frank was quiet. Finally, he said, "I'm not firing you, Danny, but this is your last chance. One more mistake like that and you're done." Danny did not sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tom Bradley falling from the scaffolding. He kept hearing Sarah Bradley's voice talking about bills and kids and no money coming in. By 3 a.m, Danny was sitting at his kitchen table with his construction book open, studying pictures of bridge supports and safety procedures. When his alarm went off at 4:30, Danny was already dressed and ready to go. He had made a decision during the long, sleepless night. He was not going to quit, and he was not going to get fired. He was going to prove that he belonged on Frank Morrison's crew. Danny got to the work site at 5:15, 45 minutes early. Frank's truck was not there yet. The bridge looked different in the early morning light, quieter, less dangerous. Danny walked around the work area, looking at everything with fresh eyes. He found the power cord he had tripped over yesterday. It was lying across a walkway where workers had to pass several times a day. Danny moved it to the side and used some tape to secure it to a beam where no one would trip over it. Then he noticed something else. The tools were scattered all over the work site from yesterday's rush to help Tom. Danny began picking them up and organizing them. He put all the wrenches in one box, all the screwdrivers in another. He coiled up the extension cords and hung them on hooks. By the time Frank arrived at 5:45, the work site was cleaner and more organized than it had been in weeks. "You're early," Frank said, getting out of his truck. "Yes, sir. Frank, I mean." Frank looked around the work site. "You did this?" "I just picked up a few things. And I moved that power cord so no one else would trip over it." Frank nodded but did not say anything. Pete and Rico arrived a few minutes later. They looked surprised to see Danny there so early. "College boys here already," Pete said to Rico. "Probably trying to make up for yesterday." "Won't help," Rico said. "A screw-up is a screw-up." Danny heard them talking, but he did not respond. He had learned something important yesterday. Getting angry or upset only made him make more mistakes. Today he was going to stay calm and focus on the work. Frank gathered the crew together. "Tom's going to be out for at least 6 weeks," he said. "That means we're short-handed. We can't afford any more delays or accidents. Everyone needs to do their job and do it right the first time." He looked directly at Danny when he said this. "Danny, today you're going to work with me on the concrete pour. Just watch and learn. Don't touch anything unless I tell you to." Danny nodded. "Okay." The concrete pour was for the base of a new support pillar. Frank showed Danny how to check the forms to make sure they were level and secure. He explained how the concrete had to be mixed to the right consistency and poured at the right speed. "Too fast and it won't settle properly," Frank said. "Too slow and it will start to harden before we're done." Danny watched everything Frank did. He asked questions when he did not understand something, but he was careful not to ask too many questions. When Frank told him to hold a measuring stick, Danny held it exactly where Frank pointed. When Frank told him to move out of the way, Danny moved quickly and stayed out of the way. The concrete pour went perfectly. No mistakes, no accidents, no problems. "Not bad," Frank said when they were cleaning up. "You can follow directions when you put your mind to it." After lunch, Frank gave Danny a different job. "I want you to inventory all the bolts and screws," he said. "Count everything and write it down. We need to know what we have and what we need to order." It was not exciting work, but Danny was grateful for it. It was something he could do without putting anyone in danger. He spent the afternoon counting bolts and screws and washers. He found several boxes that had been opened and never counted. He discovered that they had been missing some important parts for 3 days. "Frank," Danny said, showing him the inventory list, "we're missing the half-inch bolts for the railing supports. That's why you couldn't finish that section yesterday." Frank looked at the list. "You sure about this?" "I counted everything twice. We have plenty of 3/4-inch bolts, but no half-inch ones." Frank checked his own notes. Danny was right. Frank had been wondering why that section was taking so long. Now he knew. "Good work," Frank said. "I'll order the bolts tonight." For the first time since he started the job, Danny felt like he had done something useful. The next morning, Danny arrived early again. This time he brought coffee for everyone. He had stopped at the diner where his mother worked and bought 5 cups of coffee with his own money. "What's this?" Pete asked when Danny handed him a cup. "Coffee," Danny said. "I thought everyone might want some." Pete looked suspicious. "Why?" "No reason. Just thought it would be nice." Rico took his coffee without saying thank you, but Danny noticed he drank all of it. That day, Frank put Danny to work painting primer on some steel beams. It was simple work that did not require much skill, but it was important. The primer would protect the steel from rust. Danny was careful and methodical. He made sure to cover every inch of steel with an even coat of primer. When he was done, Frank inspected his work. "Good job," Frank said. "Clean work." It was not much praise, but it was the first positive thing Frank had said about Danny's work. By the end of the week, Danny had found his rhythm. He arrived early every morning and organized the tools. He brought coffee for the crew. He did whatever job Frank gave him without complaining, and he did it carefully and completely. The other workers began to notice the change. Pete stopped calling him college boy and started calling him Danny. Rico still did not say much to him, but he stopped making jokes about Danny's mistakes. On Friday afternoon, Frank gave Danny a more challenging job. He wanted Danny to help him install some new bolts in a steel beam. It required climbing up on the scaffolding and working with power tools. "You sure you trust me with this?" Danny asked. "We'll see," Frank said. "But you've been doing good work this week. Time to see if you can handle something more complicated." Danny climbed up on the scaffolding carefully, checking each step before putting his weight on it. He positioned himself where Frank told him to and held the steel beam steady while Frank drilled holes for the bolts. "Hand me that wrench," Frank said. Danny knew exactly which wrench Frank needed. He had been watching Frank work for a week, and he had learned to anticipate what tools would be needed next. "This one?" Danny asked, holding up a wrench. "That's the one." They worked together for 2 hours installing bolts and adjusting the beam to make sure it was perfectly level. Danny followed Frank's instructions exactly, and he did not make a single mistake. When they climbed down from the scaffolding, Frank looked up at their work. The beam was straight and solid and properly secured. "That's good work," Frank said. Danny felt a surge of pride. It was the first time he had helped complete something important on the bridge. That evening, as the crew was packing up to go home, Frank pulled Danny aside. "You've had a good week," Frank said. "You're starting to get the hang of this." "Thank you. I'm trying hard. I can see that. Keep it up." As Danny drove home, he felt different than he had the week before. He was tired and his hands were sore from the work, but he felt good. He felt like he was finally becoming a real construction worker. At dinner, his mother asked him about his day. "It was good," Danny said. "Frank said I did good work." "I'm proud of you," his mother said. "Your father would be proud too." That night, Danny slept better than he had since starting the job. He was still nervous about making mistakes, but he was beginning to believe that he could do this work. He was beginning to believe that Frank Morrison had not made a mistake when he hired a Greenhorn. The next Monday morning, Danny arrived at the work site to find Frank looking at some blueprints with a worried expression on his face. "Problem?" Danny asked. "Maybe," Frank said. "The city inspector is coming tomorrow. If he doesn't like what he sees, we could be shut down for weeks." Danny looked at the bridge. They had made good progress, but there was still a lot of work to do. A shutdown would be a disaster. "What can I do to help?" Danny asked. Frank looked at him with surprise. A month ago, Danny would have been another problem to worry about. Now he was offering to help solve problems. "We need to clean up everything and make sure all our safety equipment is in place," Frank said. "Think you can handle that?" "Yes," Danny said without hesitation. "All right then," Frank said. "Let's get to work." For the first time, Danny felt like he was really part of the team. He was not just the new guy who made mistakes. He was a worker who could be trusted with important jobs. It had taken him 3 weeks to get there, but he had finally found his footing. The bridge was still not finished and winter was still coming. But Danny Sullivan was no longer just a greenhorn. He was becoming something more. The city inspector came on Tuesday morning and spent 3 hours going over every inch of the bridge project. Danny watched nervously as the man in the hard hat and clipboard checked measurements, tested welds, and asked Frank dozens of questions about safety procedures. When the inspector finally left, Frank looked relieved. "We passed," Frank told the crew. "He found a few small things we need to fix, but nothing that will shut us down." Danny felt proud that he had helped prepare for the inspection. The work site had been spotless, and all the safety equipment had been exactly where it was supposed to be. But their relief did not last long. That afternoon, the weather started to change. The wind picked up and dark clouds began building on the horizon. By evening, the local news was talking about a major storm coming their way. "Looks like we're going to get hit hard," Frank said, looking at the sky. The weather service is calling for winds up to 60 miles per hour and heavy rain. Maybe some snow? Danny had never worked on a construction site during a big storm. He did not know what that meant for the bridge project. "What do we do?" he asked. "We secure everything we can and hope for the best," Frank said. "If this storm is as bad as they say, it could set us back weeks." Wednesday morning, the storm was still building. The wind was already strong enough to make the scaffolding shake. Frank gathered the crew together for a meeting. "This storm is going to hit tonight," he said. "We need to secure all the loose materials and equipment. Take down anything that could blow around and cause damage." The crew spent the morning taking apart scaffolding and moving tools and materials to a storage building near the bridge. It was hard work in the wind and cold, but everyone knew it was necessary. By afternoon, the wind was howling. Rain started falling lightly at first, then harder. Frank sent everyone home early. "No point in anyone getting hurt," he said. "We'll come back when the storm passes and see what we have left." Danny drove home through the rain, worried about the bridge. They had been making good progress, and the deadline was still tight. If the storm damaged their work, they might not be able to finish before winter. The storm hit in full force that night. Danny lay in bed listening to the wind shake his house and the rain pound on the roof. He thought about the bridge sitting out there in the storm, unprotected and unfinished. At 2 a.m, his phone rang. It was Frank. "Danny, I need you to meet me at the bridge site right now." "Now? In this storm?" "I just drove by to check on things." "We have a problem." "A big problem?" Danny got dressed and drove through the storm to the bridge site. The wind was so strong he could barely keep his car on the road. When he got to the bridge, he saw Frank's truck parked with the headlights on, pointing at the bridge. Danny could see the problem immediately. Several of the steel support beams they had installed were moving in the wind. The bolts holding them in place were working loose, and the whole structure was swaying dangerously. "If those beams break loose, they'll fall into the river," Frank shouted over the wind. "We'll lose months of work." "What can we do?" Danny asked. "Someone needs to get out there and tighten those bolts. But it's dangerous. Real dangerous. The scaffolding is slippery from the rain, and the wind could knock a man right off the bridge." Frank looked at the bridge, then at Danny. "I can't ask any of the other guys to do this. Pete's too old. Rico has a bad back, and Tom's in the hospital. It's got to be me." Danny watched Frank put on his safety harness and hard hat. Frank was 58 years old and had been doing this work for 30 years. But he was not a young man anymore. The bridge was 50 feet above the river, and the river was running fast and deep from all the rain. "Frank, wait," Danny said. "Let me do it." Frank stopped and looked at him. "You? No way. This is too dangerous for someone with your experience. I'm lighter than you are. I'll be easier for the wind to push around, but I'm also less likely to break the scaffolding if I fall. Danny, if you fall from up there, you could die. If you fall, you could die too, and you've got more to lose than I do. You've got a business, a wife, a son. I'm just a kid who's been working here for a month." Frank was quiet for a moment, thinking. The wind howled around them, and they could hear the steel beams creaking and groaning. "I can't let you do this," Frank said finally. "Frank, look at me," Danny said. "I know I screwed up when I started. I know I caused an accident that hurt Tom. But I've been learning. I've been watching you work every day for a month. I know how to tighten bolts, and I know how to be safe. Let me prove that I'm not just a greenhorn anymore." Frank looked at Danny for a long moment. Then he looked at the bridge swaying in the wind. "If I let you do this, you follow my instructions exactly. No improvising, no shortcuts. You do exactly what I tell you to do. Yes. And if I tell you to come down, you come down immediately. No arguing. Yes, Frank handed Danny the safety harness. Put this on. Double-check every buckle and strap. Danny put on the safety harness, checking and rechecking every connection. Frank inspected it and made several adjustments. You'll need this toolbox, Frank said, handing Danny a small toolbox with wrenches and a portable drill, and this radio so we can talk. Danny clipped the toolbox to his belt and put the radio in his pocket. The bolts that are loose are on the north side, about halfway up, Frank said. You can see them from here. They need to be tightened, and there are a few new bolts that need to be installed where the old ones pulled out. Danny nodded. He could see the problem area. It looked like a long way up, especially in the storm. Take your time, Frank said. Don't rush. Rushing is how people get hurt. Danny started climbing the scaffolding. The metal was slippery from the rain, and the wind tried to push him off with every step. He climbed slowly and carefully, testing each handhold and foothold before putting his weight on it. It took him 20 minutes to reach the problem area. The wind was even stronger up there, and the scaffolding was swaying back and forth. Danny clipped his safety rope to a solid beam and got to work. The first bolt was only finger-tight. In the wind and rain, it would have worked completely loose within an hour. Danny tightened it with a wrench, then moved to the next one. How's it going up there? Frank's voice came through the radio. Good, Danny said, trying to keep his voice steady. First bolt is tight. Working on the second one. The second bolt was harder. It had worked loose so far that Danny had to remove it completely and install a longer bolt. This required using the portable drill to make the hole deeper, which was difficult in the wind. Danny worked steadily for an hour, tightening bolts and installing new ones. His hands were numb from the cold and his clothes were soaked through, but he kept working. Every few minutes, Frank would check on him through the radio. The hardest part was the last bolt. It was in a position where Danny had to lean out over the river to reach it. The wind kept trying to push him off balance, and the scaffolding swayed with every gust. Danny, be careful with that last one. Frank's voice came through the radio. If you can't reach it safely, leave it. We'll figure out another way. I can reach it, Danny said. Just need a few more minutes. Danny stretched as far as he could, holding onto the scaffolding with one hand and working the wrench with the other. The bolt was rusty and difficult to turn, but finally it started to tighten. When the last bolt was secure, Danny checked all his work one more time. Everything was tight and solid. The steel beams had stopped swaying in the wind. All done, Danny said into the radio. Coming down. The climb down was almost as dangerous as the climb up. The wind seemed to be getting stronger, and Danny was tired from working for an hour in difficult conditions. But he took his time and made it safely to the ground. Frank was waiting for him with a thermos of hot coffee. How do you feel? Frank asked. Cold, Danny said, taking the coffee with shaking hands. But good. I think we saved the bridge. Frank looked up at the steel beams, which were now solid and stable in the wind. You did save the bridge, Frank said. If those beams had fallen, we would have lost 3 weeks of work and $20,000 worth of materials. Danny drank the hot coffee and felt some warmth return to his body. Danny, Frank said, what you did tonight took guts, real guts. A lot of experienced workers wouldn't have been willing to climb up there in these conditions. I wanted to prove that I could do it. You proved more than that. You proved that you care about this project. You proved that you're willing to take risks to get the job done, and you proved that I was right to give you a chance. They stood together in the storm, watching the bridge hold steady against the wind. The rain was still falling and the wind was still howling, but the bridge was safe. Frank, Danny said, can I ask you something? Sure. When you hired me, did you really think I could do this job? Or were you just desperate because you had no one else? Frank was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I was desperate. I needed help and you were the only one available. I thought you'd probably quit after a week. What changed your mind? You did. When you kept coming back every day, even after you made mistakes. When you started showing up early and bringing coffee for everyone. When you organized the tools without being asked. That showed me you cared about more than just getting a paycheck. Danny smiled. My dad always said that caring about your work was the most important thing. After the storm, everything changed between Frank and Danny. Frank stopped treating Danny like a new worker who needed constant watching. Instead, He began giving Danny more responsibility and asking for his opinions on how to solve problems. The bridge project was back on schedule, and the crew was working well together. Tom Bradley had returned to work with his arm in a lighter cast, and he held no grudges against Danny for the accident that had injured him. "Accidents happen," Tom told Danny one morning. "What matters is that you learned from it." November was almost over and the first snow was starting to fall. The crew worked longer hours to make sure they would finish before the weather got too bad for construction work. One Friday evening, as they were cleaning up the work site, Frank approached Danny. "You got any plans for Sunday?" Frank asked. "Not really. Just helping my mom around the house." "How about coming to my place for dinner? My wife's been asking about you." Danny was surprised. In the 2 months he had been working for Frank, they had never spent time together outside of work. "You sure? I mean, I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be imposing. Martha loves to cook for people, and she's curious about the young man who's been helping me build this bridge." Danny thought about it. He had never been to his boss's house before. He was not sure what to expect. "Okay," he said.
"What time?"
"Come by around 4. We usually eat early on Sundays." Frank gave Danny directions to his house, which was about 10 minutes from the bridge site. It was a nice house with a big yard and a garage where Frank kept his personal tools and worked on projects at home. On Sunday afternoon, Danny put on his best clothes and drove to Frank's house. He was nervous about meeting Frank's wife. What if she did not like him? What if he said something wrong? Martha Morrison answered the door with a smile. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She looked to be about the same age as Frank, maybe a little younger. "You must be Danny," she said, shaking his hand. "Frank's told me a lot about you." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Morrison. Call me Martha." Come in. Dinner's almost ready." Frank appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron and carrying a wooden spoon. "Frank cooks?" Danny asked, surprised. "Only on Sundays," Martha said, laughing. "It's his way of relaxing after a week of work." The house was warm and comfortable. The walls were covered with pictures of Frank and Martha's family. Danny saw photos of their son Michael at different ages, from a little boy to a man in a suit standing in front of a tall building. "That's our boy," Frank said, noticing Danny looking at the pictures. "He lives in California now. Works for a computer company. Does he like it?" Danny asked. "He says he does. Makes good money. But I don't think he's ever built anything with his hands. Sometimes I wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing." They sat down to dinner at a table in the dining room. Martha had made pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and Frank had made biscuits from scratch. It was the best meal Danny had eaten in months. "So, Danny," Martha said, "Frank tells me you've been a big help on the bridge project." "I hope so. I know I made some mistakes when I started." "Everyone makes mistakes," Martha said. "The important thing is learning from them." "That's what I keep telling him," Frank said. "But he's hard on himself." Danny was surprised that Frank had talked to his wife about him. He had not realized that Frank paid that much attention to how he felt about his work. "Tell me about your family," Martha said. "Frank mentioned you live with your mother and sister." Danny told them about his mother's job at the diner and his sister's plans to go to college. He found himself talking about his father too and how much he missed him. "He sounds like he was a good man," Martha said. "I'm sure he would be proud of you." "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. If maybe I should go to college too instead of doing construction work." Frank looked up from his plate. "Is that what you want to do? Go to college?" "I don't know. I never really thought about it before I started working for you. But I like building things. I like seeing something take shape under my hands." "There's nothing wrong with working with your hands," Frank said. "The world needs people who can build things. College is fine for some people, but it's not the only way to make a good life." After dinner, Frank showed Danny around his garage workshop. It was full of woodworking tools and half-finished projects. Frank was building a rocking chair for his first grandchild, who was due to be born in the spring. "Michael's wife is pregnant," Frank explained. "First grandkid. I want to have this chair ready for when the baby comes." Danny admired the careful work Frank had put into the chair. The wood was smooth and perfectly shaped, and the joints fit together without any gaps. "This is beautiful work," Danny said. "It's different from construction," Frank said. "More delicate. But the principles are the same. Measure twice, cut once. Take your time. Do it right the first time." They spent an hour in the garage with Frank showing Danny different woodworking techniques. Danny found it fascinating. It was like construction work, but on a smaller, more detailed scale. When it was time for Danny to go home, Martha packed up leftovers for him to take to his mother and sister. "You're welcome here any time," she said. "Frank enjoys having someone to talk shop with." As Danny drove home, he thought about the evening. He had learned something new about Frank. Away from the worksite, Frank was gentler, more thoughtful. He was still the same tough boss, but there was another side to him too. The next week at work, Danny noticed that Frank was more relaxed around him. They talked more during breaks, and Frank began asking Danny's opinion on how to handle different parts of the bridge project. "What do you think about this section here?" Frank would ask, pointing to the blueprints. "How would you approach it?" At first, Danny was hesitant to offer suggestions. Frank had 30 years of experience, and Danny had been working construction for only 2 months. But Frank seemed genuinely interested in his ideas. "I was thinking," Danny said one day, "what if we installed this section from the north side instead of the south side? It might be easier to get the crane in position." Frank studied the blueprints. "That's not a bad idea. We'd have to change the order of a few other things, but it might save us half a day of work." They tried Danny's suggestion, and it worked perfectly. Danny felt proud that he had contributed something useful to the project. As December arrived, the bridge project was nearing completion. They had made up for lost time after the storm, and it looked like they would finish just before Christmas. One afternoon, Frank pulled Danny aside. "I've been thinking," Frank said. "This bridge project is almost done, but I've got another job lined up for January. It's smaller than this one, but it's good work. I'd like you to stay on if you're interested." Danny felt a surge of happiness. "You want me to keep working for you?" "I do. You've turned into a good worker, Danny. Reliable, careful. You think about what you're doing. Those are valuable qualities in this business." "What about Pete and Rico?" "They'll be moving on to other jobs. Pete's thinking about retiring soon, and Rico's got family in Texas he wants to be closer to. Tom will probably stay on, so it would be you, me, and Tom for the next project." Danny thought about the offer. 2 months ago, he had been desperate for any job. Now Frank Morrison was asking him to stay on as a permanent member of his crew. "What's the new project?" Danny asked. "The city wants us to renovate the old courthouse. It's built like a fortress, and it needs a lot of work. But it's historical, so we have to be extra careful not to damage anything. It's the kind of job that requires patience and attention to detail." "That sounds like something I'd like to do." "Good. We'll start right after New Year's. And Danny, there'll be a raise. You've earned it." That evening, Danny went home with news that would change his life. He was no longer just a temporary worker trying to prove himself. He was a construction worker with a steady job and a future. His mother was thrilled when he told her about Frank's offer. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "Your father always said that if you worked hard and treated people right, good things would come to you." His sister Lisa was excited too. "Does this mean you'll be able to help me with college expenses?" "Some," Danny said. "Frank's giving me a raise, so we'll have a little more money coming in." That night, Danny lay in bed thinking about how much his life had changed since that morning in October when he had walked into the unemployment office. He had been a scared kid with no experience and no confidence. Now he was a construction worker with skills and a future, but more than that, he had found something he had not expected to find. In Frank Morrison, he had found a mentor and a friend, someone who believed in him and was willing to teach him, someone who had become like a father to him. Danny did not know it, but Frank was thinking similar thoughts as he lay in bed that night. His own son lived 3,000 miles away and rarely called. He had a good job and a good life, but he was not interested in the work that had shaped Frank's entire life. In Danny Sullivan, Frank had found something he had not expected either. A young man who was eager to learn and willing to work hard. Someone who reminded Frank of himself when he was young and hungry for knowledge about construction. Frank had started out thinking he was doing Danny a favor by giving him a job. Now he realized that Danny had done him a favor too. The Millerville Bridge was finished on December 18th, 3 days before the deadline. The whole town turned out for the opening ceremony. The mayor gave a speech about how important the bridge was for connecting the community. Frank and his crew were given a plaque thanking them for their work. Danny stood with Frank and Tom as the mayor cut the ribbon. He felt proud to be part of the team that had built something so important. Cars began driving across the new bridge, and Danny could see that it was solid and strong. It would serve the town for many years to come. After the ceremony, Frank took Danny and Tom out for dinner at the best restaurant in town. "This one's on me," Frank said. "You boys earned it." Over dinner, Frank told them about the courthouse project that would start in January. "It's going to be different from the bridge," Frank said. "The courthouse was built in 1895. It's made of brick and stone, and every detail was carved by hand. We have to preserve as much of the original work as possible, while making it safe and functional for modern use." Tom looked interested. "What kind of work are we talking about?" "New electrical and plumbing systems, restoring the windows and doors, fixing the roof, rebuilding the front steps. It's going to require a lot of careful, detailed work." Danny listened as Frank described the project. It sounded challenging but interesting. He had never worked on a historical building before. "The city council is taking a big chance on us," Frank said. "This is the biggest contract I've ever been awarded. If we do good work, it could lead to other historical restoration projects. If we mess it up, my reputation will be ruined." "We won't mess it up," Danny said confidently. Frank smiled. "I like your attitude, son. But we're going to need more than attitude. We're going to need to learn some new skills." The next few weeks, between Christmas and New Year's, Danny spent time at the library reading about historical building restoration. He checked out books about 19th century construction techniques and studied pictures of similar courthouse renovations in other towns. Frank was impressed when Danny showed up for their first planning meeting with a notebook full of ideas and suggestions. "You've been doing your homework," Frank said. "I want to understand what we're getting into. This courthouse is important to the town. People have been getting married there and voting there and conducting business there for almost 100 years. We have a responsibility to treat it with respect." Frank nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude." They spent the morning walking through the courthouse with the city manager, taking measurements and making notes about what needed to be repaired or replaced. The building was in worse condition than Danny had expected. Some of the windows were broken, the roof leaked in several places, and the electrical system was so old it was dangerous. But underneath all the problems, Danny could see the beauty of the original construction. The stonework was incredible, and the woodwork inside the building was carved with intricate designs. It was clear that the men who had built this courthouse had taken great pride in their work. "This is going to be a big job," Tom said as they finished their inspection. 6 months at least," Frank agreed. "Maybe longer if we run into problems." But Danny was excited about the challenge. "Frank, what would you think about me taking some evening classes?" "What kind of classes?" "There's a community college about an hour from here. They have courses in historical restoration and architectural preservation. I thought it might help me understand this kind of work better." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good idea. The more you know about this stuff, the better job we can do. I'll pay for the classes if you want to take them." "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. If you're going to learn skills that help my business, then it's a business expense. Besides, I want you to be the best craftsman you can be." Danny enrolled in 2 classes that started in January: historical building materials and restoration techniques. The classes met 2 evenings a week, and Danny found them fascinating. He learned about different types of mortar used in 19th century construction and how to match new materials to old ones. He studied techniques for restoring damaged stonework and preserving original woodwork. The courthouse project officially began on January 15th. Frank had hired 2 additional workers for the job, an electrician named Carlos and a mason named Joe who specialized in historical stonework. "This is a different kind of construction crew," Frank told Danny on the first day. "Everyone here is a specialist. Carlos knows more about old electrical systems than anyone in the state. Joe has restored buildings all over the Midwest, and you're going to be my detail man." "Detail man?" "The guy who makes sure everything is done exactly right. The guy who catches problems before they become disasters. The guy who knows what the building is supposed to look like when we're finished." It was a big responsibility, but Danny was ready for it. He had prepared for this job more thoroughly than he had ever prepared for anything in his life. The first few weeks were spent carefully removing modern additions that had been poorly installed over the years. Someone had covered the original wooden floors with linoleum. Someone else had painted over beautiful carved woodwork. Danny's job was to figure out how to remove these modern materials without damaging the original construction underneath. It was slow, painstaking work. Danny would spend hours carefully scraping paint off a single piece of carved wood, using techniques he had learned in his evening classes. But when the original wood emerged clean and beautiful, Danny felt a deep satisfaction that was different from anything he had experienced on the bridge project. "Look at this," Danny said to Frank one afternoon, showing him a section of restored woodwork. "You can see every detail of the original carving. Someone spent days creating this by hand." Frank examined Danny's work. "That's beautiful restoration. You've got a real talent for this kind of work." As the weeks went by, Danny found himself taking on more and more responsibility for the project. Frank began asking him to make decisions about how to approach difficult restoration problems. When the city council members came to check on the progress, Frank would often ask Danny to explain what they were doing and why. "Danny here is our historical preservation specialist," Frank would say. "He's been studying this stuff in college." Danny felt proud every time Frank introduced him that way. He was no longer just Frank's helper. He was becoming a specialist in his own right. One day in March, they discovered a problem that threatened to delay the entire project. When they removed some modern paneling from the main courtroom, they found that the original plaster walls underneath had been severely damaged by water leaks. The damage was so extensive that the walls would need to be completely rebuilt. "This is going to add at least 6 weeks to the project," Frank said, looking at the damaged walls, "and probably $20,000 to the cost." Danny studied the problem carefully. Then he had an idea. "What if we don't rebuild the walls?" He said. "What do you mean?" "What if we restore them? I've been reading about a technique called lime plastering. It's what they would have used originally. If we remove all the damaged plaster and replace it with lime plaster mixed to match the original, it would be stronger and more authentic than modern materials." Frank looked skeptical. "Do you know how to do lime plastering?" "I can learn. Joe knows some of the techniques, and there's a master plasterer in Kansas City who teaches workshops. I could go learn from him and then teach the rest of us." Frank thought about it. That would take time. Less time than tearing down the walls and rebuilding them. And it would be better for the building. Frank discussed the idea with the city council. They were impressed that Danny wanted to use original techniques and materials. They agreed to pay for Danny to attend the plastering workshop. Danny spent a week in Kansas City learning traditional lime plastering from a master craftsman who had restored buildings all over the country. When he came back, he taught the techniques to Frank, Tom, and the other workers. The lime plastering work took 3 weeks, but when it was finished, the courtroom walls looked exactly as they had when the building was new in 1895. The city council was thrilled with the results. "This is incredible work," the mayor said during one of his visits. "You can't tell where the new plaster ends and the old plaster begins." By this time, word about the courthouse restoration was spreading beyond Millerville. A reporter from the regional newspaper came to write a story about the project. She interviewed Frank and Danny about their approach to historical restoration. "We believe in preserving the past while making buildings functional for the future," Frank told the reporter. "Danny here has been the driving force behind maintaining historical authenticity while solving modern problems." The newspaper article brought attention from other towns and organizations that had historical buildings in need of restoration. Frank began receiving calls asking about potential projects. "We might need to think about expanding," Frank told Danny one evening as they cleaned up the work site. "If all these projects work out, we're going to need more people." "What kind of expansion?" Danny asked. "Maybe we should think about specializing in historical restoration. There's a real market for it, and we're getting good at it. But it would mean focusing less on regular construction and more on preservation work." The partnership between Frank Morrison and Danny Sullivan was officially formed in July 1988. They changed the name of the business to Morrison and Sullivan Construction, and Danny's name appeared on the company truck for the first time. The courthouse restoration had been such a success that new projects began coming in faster than they could handle them. The Historical Society in the next county wanted them to restore an old church. A wealthy family in Lincoln hired them to renovate a Victorian mansion. The State University asked them to bid on restoring several buildings on their campus. "We're going to need more help," Frank said as they looked at all the project requests piling up on his desk. "What about hiring some of the guys from the bridge crew?" Danny suggested. "Pete might come out of retirement for the right project, and Rico said he might move back from Texas if we had steady work for him." "Good thinking. And we'll need to train them in historical restoration techniques. You up for teaching what you've learned?" Danny smiled. "I'd love to." Over the next 2 years, Morrison and Sullivan Construction grew from 3 employees to 12. They became known throughout Nebraska and Kansas as the best team for historical restoration work. Every project was different, and each one taught them something new. Danny continued taking classes in the evenings, studying architectural history, and learning about different periods of construction. He became an expert at identifying the age and style of buildings just by looking at their construction details. Frank, meanwhile, focused on the business side of the partnership. He learned how to write grant applications for historical preservation projects and how to work with historical societies and government agencies. Together, they made a perfect team. By 1990, they had restored churches, schools, mansions, and government buildings all across the Midwest. Their reputation was growing, and they were making more money than either of them had ever imagined possible. But success brought its own challenges. In the spring of 1992, they were working on their biggest project yet, restoring the state capitol building in Topeka, Kansas. It was a massive job that would take 2 years to complete and involve dozens of workers. The pressure was enormous. If they succeeded, Morrison & Sullivan Construction would become one of the premier restoration companies in the region. If they failed, the damage to their reputation would be devastating. Frank had been working 12-hour days for months, managing the complex logistics of the capital project while trying to keep their other work on schedule. The stress was beginning to show. He was losing weight and he seemed tired all the time. Danny tried to get Frank to slow down, but Frank insisted he was fine. "This project is too important," Frank said. "We can't afford any mistakes." On a hot Tuesday morning in June, Danny arrived at the Capitol building to find Frank's truck already in the parking lot. That was unusual because Danny had been getting to work sites earlier than Frank lately. Knowing how exhausted his partner was, Danny found Frank sitting in his truck with the door open, holding his chest and breathing heavily. "Frank, what's wrong?" "I'm okay," Frank said, but his face was pale and sweaty. "Just feel a little dizzy. You're not okay. I'm taking you to the hospital." "No, we've got too much work to do today. I'll be fine in a minute." But Frank was clearly not fine. Danny helped him out of the truck and into Danny's car. Frank did not have the strength to argue anymore. At the hospital, the doctors said Frank had suffered a heart attack. Not a massive one, but serious enough to require immediate treatment and several days in the hospital. "He's been under too much stress," the doctor told Danny. "His blood pressure is dangerously high, and his heart is working too hard. He needs to rest and reduce his stress level, or this could happen again." Danny spent the next several days running between the hospital and the job sites, trying to keep all their projects on schedule while making sure Frank was getting proper medical care. Frank was worried about the business. "What's happening with the capital project?" he asked every time Danny visited. "Everything's under control," Danny assured him. "Tom's supervising the stonework. Carlos is handling the electrical, and I'm coordinating with the state project managers. Don't worry about work. Just focus on getting better." But Frank could not stop worrying. Morrison & Sullivan Construction was his life's work, and he felt like he was letting everyone down by being in the hospital. Danny realized he needed to prove to Frank that the business could run smoothly without him. For the next 6 weeks while Frank recovered, Danny took complete control of all their projects. It was the hardest 6 weeks of Danny's life. He was working 16 hours a day, making decisions about technical problems, managing workers, dealing with clients, and handling the financial side of the business. There were moments when he felt completely overwhelmed, but he also discovered something important about himself. He could do it. All the years of watching Frank work, all the classes he had taken, all the experience he had gained had prepared him for this moment. When problems arose on the capital project, Danny solved them. When clients had questions about other jobs, Danny had the answers. When workers needed guidance, Danny provided it. The business not only survived Frank's absence, it thrived. Every project stayed on schedule, and the quality of work remained as high as ever. When Frank finally returned to work in August, he found everything running smoothly. "I can't believe you kept everything together," Frank said, looking at the progress reports Danny had prepared. "We're a team," Danny said. "That's what partners do for each other." Frank's heart attack had been a wake-up call for both of them. Frank realized he needed to delegate more responsibility and trust Danny's judgment. Danny realized he was ready to take on much more leadership in the company. They restructured their partnership after Frank's recovery. Danny would handle day-to-day operations and client relations, while Frank would focus on long-term planning and training new workers. It was a division of labor that played to both of their strengths. The Capitol building project was completed successfully in the spring of 1994. The restoration was so impressive that it won a national award from the American Institute of Architects. Morrison and Sullivan Construction was featured in several magazines, and job offers began coming in from all over the country. But success also brought personal challenges. Danny's mother had been battling cancer for several months. She had not told him how serious it was, not wanting to worry him during Frank's recovery in the Capitol project. When Danny finally learned the truth, the doctors said she had only a few months to live. Danny was devastated. His mother had been his anchor since his father's death. She had encouraged him to take the construction job with Frank, and she had been proud of every success he had achieved. Frank immediately told Danny to take whatever time he needed to be with his mother. "Family comes first," Frank said. "The business will be here when you get back." Danny spent the last 3 months of his mother's life taking care of her. He moved back into his childhood home and worked reduced hours so he could drive her to doctor appointments and make sure she was comfortable. During those difficult months, Frank and Martha Morrison became like second parents to Danny. They brought meals, helped with household chores, and provided emotional support during the hardest time of Danny's life. "Your mother is proud of the man you've become," Martha told Danny one evening as they sat in the hospital waiting room. "She's told me so many times how happy she is that you found Frank and discovered your calling." Danny's mother passed away peacefully on a Sunday morning in November 1994. Danny was holding her hand when she died. Her last words to him were, "Take care of Frank. He needs you as much as you need him." The funeral was held at the church where Danny's family had attended services since he was a child. Frank and Martha were there, along with Tom and several other workers from Morrison and Sullivan Construction. The church was full of people whose lives Danny's mother had touched during her years working at the diner. After the funeral, Danny felt lost. His mother and his work had been the two most important things in his life. With his mother gone, work became even more important to him. Frank understood what Danny was going through. He had lost his own father when he was young, and he knew how difficult it was to continue living normally after such a loss. "Grief is hard work," Frank told Danny. "But the best way to honor your mother's memory is to keep building the life she was proud of you for creating." Danny threw himself into work with renewed energy. The company continued to grow, and their reputation continued to spread. By 1995, they were employing 25 people and working on projects in 6 different states. But Frank's health remained a concern. The heart attack had weakened him, and he tired more easily than before. The doctors had told him to reduce stress and take better care of himself, but Frank was not good at following medical advice. In the summer of 1996, Frank had another health scare. This time it was not a heart attack, but his blood pressure had spiked dangerously high during a particularly stressful week when 3 different projects were facing deadline problems. Danny found Frank in his office one evening, slumped over his desk with a severe headache and blurred vision. "That's it," Danny said, helping Frank to his car. "We're going to the doctor." 20 years had passed since that cold October morning when Frank Morrison reluctantly hired a nervous 19-year-old with no experience. It was now 2007, and Frank was 78 years old. His hair was completely white, and he moved, more slowly than he used to. But his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that had made him a successful construction foreman and businessman. Danny was 39 now, a confident man who had built Morrison and Sullivan Construction into one of the most respected restoration companies in the Midwest. The company employed 42 people and had completed over 300 projects in 12 states. On this particular morning, Frank sat on the porch of his house drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. It was his favorite time of day, when the world was quiet and he could think about how much his life had changed. Martha brought him a second cup of coffee and sat down in the chair next to him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Danny," Frank said, "and how different things might have been if I hadn't hired him that day." "You mean if you had been sensible and hired someone with experience?" Frank laughed. "Exactly. I keep thinking about what I almost missed. That boy became the best thing that ever happened to my business. Maybe the best thing that ever happened to me. Period. He's not a boy anymore, Frank. He's a successful businessman with his own family. Frank nodded. Danny had married Tom Bradley's daughter, Sarah, 3 years earlier. They had recently bought a house just a few miles from Frank and Martha's place, and Sarah was expecting their first child in the fall. The phone rang, and Martha went inside to answer it. She came back a moment later with a smile on her face. That was Danny. He's bringing someone by the worksite this morning that he wants you to meet. Frank was curious, but not surprised. Danny often brought visitors to see their current project, which was the restoration of the old Millerville Opera House. It was a beautiful building from 1902 that had been abandoned for 30 years before the city decided to restore it as a community center. Frank finished his coffee and drove to the worksite. Morrison and Sullivan Construction had come full circle in a way. They were working in Millerville again, just a few blocks from where they had first worked together on the bridge project. When Frank arrived, he saw Danny talking to a young woman near the entrance to the opera house. She looked to be about 18 or 19, with short dark hair and nervous energy that reminded Frank of someone. "Frank," Danny called out, "I want you to meet someone. This is Maria Santos." Frank walked over and shook the young woman's hand. She had a firm grip and looked him directly in the eye, which Frank appreciated. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison. Danny's told me a lot about you." "Has he? What kind of things?" Maria smiled. "He told me you gave him his first job even though he had no experience, and that you taught him everything he knows about construction." Frank glanced at Danny, who was grinning. "Maria just graduated from high school," Danny said. "She's been reading about our company and historical restoration work. She wants to learn the trade." Frank studied the young woman more carefully. There was something familiar about her eagerness and determination. "Do you have any construction experience?" Frank asked. "No, sir, but I'm willing to work hard and learn. I've been reading books about building techniques and historical preservation. I know it's not the same as real experience, but I want to understand the work." Frank almost smiled. It was like listening to Danny 20 years ago. Why construction? Why not go to college or get an office job? Maria straightened her shoulders. "My grandfather was a carpenter. He came here from Mexico when he was young and worked on buildings all over the state. He died when I was 12, but he used to tell me stories about the houses and churches he helped build. I want to do that kind of work. I want to build things that will last." Now Frank did smile. The girl reminded him not just of Danny, but of himself when he was young and hungry for meaningful work. "Danny," Frank said, "what do you think? Should we give her a chance?" Danny looked at Maria, then at Frank. "I think we should. Everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves." Frank heard his own words being repeated back to him, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Danny had learned more than just construction skills during his 20 years with the company. He had learned the importance of giving people opportunities to grow and succeed. "All right, Maria," Frank said. "You can start Monday morning. Same rules as everyone else. Show up on time, work hard, listen to instructions, and ask questions when you don't understand something." Maria's face lit up with joy. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. You won't regret this." "Don't thank me yet," Frank said with a grin. "Thank me if you're still working here in a month." As Maria walked away to fill out paperwork with the company secretary, Frank and Danny stood together watching her go. "She reminds me of someone," Frank said. "Yeah, she does. A scared kid who showed up at the unemployment office 20 years ago wearing his father's work boots. That scared kid turned out pretty well. He had a good teacher. They walked through the opera house together, checking on the progress of various restoration projects. The building was coming along beautifully. The original plaster had been carefully restored, the wooden floors had been refinished to their original luster, and the ornate ceiling had been painstakingly repaired and repainted. "This is good work," Frank said, admiring a section of restored decorative molding. "Your crew knows what they're doing." "Our crew," Danny corrected. "You trained most of these people, Frank. I just keep them organized." Frank appreciated Danny's modesty, but they both knew that Danny had become much more than just an organizer. He was a master craftsman, a skilled businessman and a natural leader. Under his guidance, Morrison and Sullivan Construction had achieved things that Frank had never imagined possible when he started the company 30 years earlier. "Danny," Frank said, "I want to talk to you about something." "What's that?" "I'm thinking about retiring. For real this time." Danny stopped walking and looked at Frank with concern. "Are you feeling all right? Is your health okay?" "My health is fine. I just think it's time. I'm 78 years old. I've been working construction for almost 50 years. Maybe it's time to step back and let you run the company completely." Danny was quiet for a moment. "What would you do if you retired?" "Spend time with Martha. Travel a little. Maybe write a book about historical restoration techniques, and spend time with my first grandchild when he or she arrives." Frank's son Michael had finally had a child the previous year, and Frank had discovered that he loved being a grandfather. But the baby lived in California, and Frank could only visit a few times a year. "Danny and Sarah's baby will be like another grandchild to me," Frank continued. "I want to be around to help raise that child, to teach him or her about building things with their hands." Danny smiled. "You know, we don't even know if it's a boy or a girl yet. Doesn't matter. Either way, I want to pass on what I know about this work, the same way I passed it on to you." They continued walking through the opera house, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Danny spoke. "If you retire, what happens to your share of the company?" "I've been thinking about that. I want to sell it to you. Not for full market value because you've earned a bigger stake than you currently have, but for enough to help Martha and me live comfortably in retirement." Danny nodded slowly. "I think I can arrange that. The company's doing well enough to handle the purchase. There's one condition, though." "What's that?" "I want you to promise me that you'll keep giving chances to young people like Maria, like yourself 20 years ago. Don't just hire experienced workers. Take some risks on people who are hungry to learn." "That's an easy promise to make. Some of our best workers have been people we trained from scratch." They finished their tour of the opera house and walked outside into the sunshine. Frank looked around at the bustling work site, with skilled craftsmen carefully restoring a piece of the town's history. "You know," Frank said, "when I hired you, I thought I was doing you a favor. I had no idea you were going to change my life." "How did I change your life?" "You gave me a son I could be proud of. My own boy is successful, and I love him. But he never wanted to learn this work. He never understood what I was passionate about. You did. You took everything I could teach you and made it your own. Then you made it better." Danny felt a lump in his throat. "Frank, you saved my life when you hired me. I was a kid with no direction and no future. You gave me both." "No, son. You saved yourself. I just gave you the opportunity. You did the rest." They stood together in comfortable silence, two men who had built something lasting together. Around them, workers were carefully restoring a building that would serve the community for many years to come. Across town, the bridge they had built together 20 years earlier was still carrying traffic safely from one side of Millerville to the other. "Frank," Danny said finally, "there's something I want to ask you." "What's that?" "When you retire, would you consider staying involved with the training program? Not full-time, but maybe teaching the new apprentices about the fundamentals of construction work? About safety and quality and taking pride in your craftsmanship?" Frank's face lit up. "I'd love that. Teaching is what I enjoy most about this work now."